Hi there. I'm delighted to be here in the wonderful surroundings of Glenmorangie House, on a fabulous press trip to talk about a brand new project at Glenmorangie Distillery. But I'm more delighted to be sitting here with Dr. Bill Lumsden, who's the Director of Whisky Creation at Glenmorangie. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for taking
My
some
pleasure.
time to talk to us. For people that maybe don't know Glenmorangie so well or think they know Glenmorangie, what could you just quickly tell us about the distillery and about the brand?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the brand, if I can start there first, and it's absolutely not only what got me into the brand back in the day, but what got me into malt whiskey is that it's a beautiful, soft, accessible flavour. And some of the whiskies we make in Scotland can be not for the faint-hearted in terms of the big punch the flavour gives. But it was genuinely the first single malt I ever tasted in 1984, and I marvelled at the lovely, complex but soft and very accessible flavour. And of course, we have whiskies in the range which are much more robust than that, particularly as you go up the age scale. But I'd say more than anything, Glenmorangie is renowned for this soft and, dare I use the D word, delicious flavour. And the distillery itself was, robustly traditional and old-fashioned. And when I joined as distillery manager at the end of 1994, it was just so. But due to, technology moving on, but especially the ever-growing demand globally, the distillery is a lot bigger now than it was, and we've had to move for the times in terms of sustainability and our environmental credentials. However, that's not really what people want to hear. If you come to the Glenmorangie distillery, you will see the tallest pot stills in the malt whisky industry, which not only look magnificent, but they are largely responsible for making a very complex tasting spirit.
It's actually interesting you say that about sort of getting into Scotch whisky, because Glenmorangie was actually the distillery we visited first.
Yeah.
We didn't know anything about whisky at all, and it really kind of, sort of got something, sort of inside us that has then obviously grown to what we both do now. So that's just sort of really interesting and great to hear. But obviously we're here for this new project, the Lighthouse Distillery, which kind of takes Glenmorangie in a slightly different direction. So can you just sort of explain a bit about that and what the aim is and so on?
Absolutely. And I'm a scientist, so I still love to learn and experiment with things. And I carried out hundreds of experiments at the distillery over the years, and in particular using different barrel types. But over the last 10 to 15 years, I was starting to focus a little bit more on primary production. So the malted barley, the mashing, the fermentation, the distillation. And the main distillery is a classic, typical malt whisky distillery. So some of the things I wanted to do and try just were not feasible in the main distillery. So the Lighthouse, as we call this project, is a completely standalone distillery on the same site, where I can either divert fermented wash or whatever down from the main distillery, or we can create it from scratch. But basically this is to allow me to carry out all these funky experiments that I couldn't do in the main distillery.
Yeah, and what is the sort of longer term goal? Is there actually going to be some products coming, or do you simply not know?
Well, at my ripe old age of 61, Matt, maybe longer term goals are kind of not something I think about. But essentially, when I create whiskies, generally I don't start with, I wonder what would happen if I used this yeast. I normally envisage a particular flavour or a feeling or a mood or something like that, and that's what starts my creative process off. So the Lighthouse should allow me to create all of these flavours that I haven't been able to do in the big distillery.
Yeah, that sounds great. It sounds like you're going to have a lot of fun.
Well, I think that the scope for what we can do there is endless, and as you saw in your sneak preview yesterday, we've got all sorts of bells and whistles, and this is just the first generation of the lighthouse, and I will be adding and building to that over the years. But the other main thing is that given the success of the brand just now, the main distillery and Eddie, the manager, needs to squeeze out every last drop. So I don't want to interrupt the production schedule. So that's the other reason why we've built this.
Yeah, that just sounds like you're going to have a great time. So yeah, can't wait to see some of the things coming out of there. And leading on from that, to celebrate the opening, you've created a special whiskey which we've got here. It's the Glenmorangie, the Lighthouse, 12 years old. So bring it a bit closer. There we are. So what can you tell us about that, Bill, and sort of how you created it, what you were sort of looking for with that?
I mean, in a very unusual act of generosity, I doff my cap to our CEO, and it was him that wanted somehow to incorporate casks, because the Glenmorangie company is renowned for its wood policy and cask management. And
one of the early innovators, actually.
Absolutely, yeah. And he wanted somehow to have casks as part of this story, because of course it's all about primary production and mainly the distillation. And originally we thought, well, we can have some empty barrels here and there. We had a fence running along the bottom of the warehousing complex one where the staves were made of staves from casks, and I suggested that. But I think he wanted something a bit more than that. So we worked with the architects who designed the tower that the distillery is in, and eventually came up with the idea of grinding down casks to make a different type of wood. And so the lining inside the glass of the tower is made from ground up casks. So once we had understood that there was the technology available to do that, I thought, right. So I chose a batch of casks, about 20% Oloroso sherry, 80% bourbon, all 12-year-old, and we emptied that. The casks were sent to the architects who did their stuff with making the lining, and we vatted together. I tasted and approved and bottled the whiskey.
So it's limited edition.
Oh, it was a very limited, just over 4,000 bottles,
and
all individually numbered.
Oh, great! And what sort of strength is it?
The strength is 48% ABV, and I didn't choose that strength just to make it different. The way I tend to do this in the lab is that I will taste the whiskies at their natural cask strength, which for a 12-year-old will probably hovering around about 55-56%, and then I will reduce the strength in increments and finally get to a strength where I think that's the sweet spot, where everything's just working together in terms of the aroma, the flavour, the mouthfeel, and for this it was 48.
And obviously then for a different expression it would be a different level.
Absolutely, and you see this particularly in our Ardbeg brand, Matt, where we have, and I just love this idea, marketing don't like it, but 47.2% or 54.1%, just something a little bit different.
And how would you describe the aroma and flavour profile of the Lighthouse?
Yeah, so for this whiskey here, and you can tell from the colour, there's an influence of something in there, and it's the 20% Oloroso sherry casks. What I was looking for was to have the sherry cask influence as the backbone of the flavour profile, but then if you like, the skeleton coming out of that was all classic Glenmorangie with vanilla and citrus fruit and things like that. So if you imagine Glenmorangie La Santa, which is a bit of a big sherry bomb, this is not that. It's a much more subtle and elegant expression of it.
So I guess there's, like you were saying earlier, the delicacy and complexity of the spirit could easily be overshadowed if you had too much sherry influence.
It's very easy to do it with single malt Scotch, and it's especially easy to do it with a whiskey of the style of Glenmorangie, which has that delicacy and complexity. And I do like the influence of sherry cask, but we've got sherry cask in La Santa, we've got sherry cask in 18-year-old, we've got sherry cask in Signet, but apart from Lasanta, they will never be the dominant flavour profile there. They will just be there to kind of anchor everything together.
That's great. Thanks so much for sharing that with us.
My
Bill.
pleasure.
It's going to be very exciting to see sort of what comes out of the Lighthouse Distillery, and thanks so much for talking to us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you.